Thank you for staying with us on The Big Story. So let's talk about 100% transition from primary school to secondary school. The government says you're leaving no one behind, but then the challenges that are clearly being seen across board. So you're having this conversation with Amos Kaburu, who's a program manager at PAL Network. We also have Jonathan Messiah, who's an education expert. Messiah, let me begin with you. I did mention that the government has allowed principals to increase school fees so as to help with infrastructure development in schools. And this is not the beginning. There's bound to be more decisions that will be made to accommodate this 100% transition. And there were experts who actually warned before. They said, if you're getting into 100% transition, there has to be proper planning.
Yeah, Linda, I think the decision by the Ministry of Education today to give principals, the leeway to levy fees is a decision that shows the lack of preparedness, the lack of planning on the part of the Ministry of Education. Because what is happening is that schools are already on recess. They are closed. So it means that the students already went home with guidelines on what amount of fees they need to pay next year. Because what usually happens as part of the closing ceremony in school, they usually give what they call the school newsletter and the fees guidelines to parents. So it's going to be very difficult for the management of the school to demand a particular amount of money from learners when they report in January, when that information was not communicated to the guardians and parents in good time. It is literally an ambush, and for many schools within the guidelines of the Ministry of Education, they indicate a practice of governance, which is that there must be an AGM that adopts the plans of the school and the budget, and it is from those plans that then numbers are crunched and the fees guidelines for the individual school are developed and then shared with parents and guardians. Now, when we do this already at a point when schools have already closed, it makes it very difficult because in many schools the tradition is that they have to get in during the first term, forecast for the rest of the year, then develop a plan, and that requires the ratification by an AGM. So as it is not going to add value. But number two, what is happening is that the president, the deputy president, the cabinet secretary have been out there assuring Kenyans that 100% transition is going to happen with a subsidy on fees. And that is why we have a flat figure for secondary, for national schools and extra county schools pegged at slightly lower than 60,000 shillings. Now, when this is opened up, we are going to go back to where we were before the subsidy came in, because we are going to push the fees again to 100,000 shillings, and this is money that many households cannot afford. But the third thing I want to mention, when the chair of the Education Committee in Parliament was being asked questions on how they are holding the ministry to account, you notice that the MP spoke as if he is a member of the executive. He did not speak to the issue of holding the ministry to account, because since 2017, the Education Committee needed to have set targets for the Ministry of Education, so that when the ministry goes back to give a status update, they are saying that on issues of infrastructure, we planned for this and we are at 30%, we are at 40%. The cabinet secretary also promised when he was releasing the KCPE results that the government is setting aside 8 billion shillings for infrastructure. Has this money been released, or where has it gone that today the cabinet secretary realizes that schools need to levy fees? So those are the questions that we need to answer.
Why now the government is allowing principals to increase school fees. But Kaburu, just listening into Mele, he said, yes, we understand that the students are suffering, but it's better to have them in school rather than have them outside. And Wasaya just addressed the issue of raising school fees. But I've had several teachers saying, and principals saying, it is impossible to run our schools with the amount of money that we have. So yes, we are blaming, or parents are blaming principals for raising school fees, but then they are also, their hands are tied. They cannot operate under the circumstances which they have. There are several challenges with this 100% transition.
Thank you, Linda. I totally agree with Jonathan and the chair of the Education Committee. What you're actually doing is reversing a lot of gains that we've made in the last 5 years. Because it will not make sense that we trying to increase access, whereas at the same time we are again introducing the same barrier that has been the challenge towards achieving increased access, because financial barriers are the leading cause of why we cannot achieve high access, or rather what we've typified or given an image of 100% transition. Now, I think we need to put this issue into perspective, that the ministry is basically caving into the pressure that has been there, because if you look at the heads have always been against the issue of price ceilings in terms of school fees. So you never know what kind of concessions that the ministry is making with the Heads Association. But I think that it is unfortunate on the part of Parliament if it cannot hold the ministry to account, including putting sanctions to the ministry, because we must be a little bit bold and candid in terms of what we do. We must be a bit deliberate in terms of what we want to achieve. I am personally convinced that the situation is not as bad as the heads are trying to paint it. The situation is not as bad as we're trying to make that 100% transition should fail. This is a good initiative. I totally agree with Honorable Meli that it's better to have children in school, whether congested or whatever. It's better to keep them in school for 12 years, rather than when we now begin opening up spaces for we can lose all these children or whatever numbers, even if it's 10%, 20%. I think it should not be encouraged. The Kenyan people in their wisdom decided that we should provide free and compulsory basic education, which the Basic Education Act defines to be 12 years of continuous learning. So I think we need to be a bit more deliberate. We need to look at possibilities. And if you look at the role that Parliament has played through the National Government Constituency Development Fund, there's significant resources, close to 20% of the resources from CDF that have gone into developing schools. So I think that there is a way in which perhaps particular stakeholders are really twisting the government. But because we have a challenge of how to have centralized information that will really allow us to be 100% sure of what we are talking about, what is exactly the need that we are addressing at the moment. So I am not convinced that the situation is that bad. What we really need to be doing is, yes, to increase capacities, as the MP has said, whereas over 50% of the children are going to, close to 62% of the children are going to day secondary schools. That is what we need to be fixing. But if we now begin to allow these situations where we are now selling education to the rich, then I think we reverse all the gains that we have made. So for me, it's a really sad day that we can really cave in. And if I look at the pain that the former CS, Professor Kaimenyi, really had working with Dr. Kilemi just to try and fix what this challenge that we have had. So when we again open up these floodgates of confusion, as we're trying to do, for anyone who really believes in universalization of education and massification of the same, I think it's such a terrible and such a sad day to really just imagine that we are back to where we were in 2014.
On some point, because you say you agree with Meli that we'd rather keep children in school rather than outside. But then what you're basically saying is that you're making students pay for the government's inability to plan. And you're very categorically saying we need to increase capacity. Who was supposed to increase this capacity? Who failed on their job? Why are you making children pay for mistakes that are not their own? Wesaya?
I think what we need to call out deliberately and very consciously is that there is a lack of leadership in the education sector in Kenya. I say this because we have seen initiatives that hinge on personalities that are not transferable, they are not replicable in a situation where the person who initiated them is not there. We hinge on global perspectives and say we need 100% transition, we need to universalize access to education, but we fail to build checks and balances within the system to ensure that as this happens, critical elements are not lost. Linda, for any education to be education, and when I say this, it is elimu bora, not bora elimu. Our children are not going to school to get bora elimu. They should get elimu bora. And for that to happen, the content within the system that the children are being provided and facilitated to learn must be relevant to the situations. The learning environment is also a critical element of quality. So we cannot be talking about quality when we have classes that are overcrowded, we have dormitories that have triple deckers, we have spaces in some schools, laboratories, dining halls have been turned into dormitories. They are literally unsafe. The management and governance of these schools need to be playing a central role. But there are also issues of funding and how that funding is organized. Why I'm saying there is a lack of leadership is the failure of the Ministry of Education to sit down with the Education Committee in Parliament and rally that members of Parliament commit a percentage of their CDF budget onto a particular program, a strategy developed to increase enrollment and transition from primary to secondary education. This needed to have started in 2003. Linda, as we speak today, the children who are joining Form 1 in January 2020 are the second complete cohort of children who started free primary education. It is exactly 16 years. So we have failed to plan for these children for 16 years. Why should they continue paying higher levies just because somebody was employed, they reported on duty, but they did not do anything? So we need to smoke out some of the people who should be thinking in Jogo House, because we cannot have edicts delivered by every cabinet secretary that contradict the previous one. We need concerted effort. These guys need to be speaking from a strategy, from a script that is consistent.
Can Messiah hear me? Yes, you can hear me. So I listened into the Education Cabinet Secretary George Magoha today, and he actually alluded to that fact. He said, I know there's pressure for us to be able to deliver, but I wish leaders, especially members of parliament, could set aside a certain amount to come up with at least a school or set up an infrastructure. Then we can all work together towards building this. But I like what you're saying, that we cannot allow children to learn in some of the scenarios that you're talking about. Kaburu, this is where I bring into this conversation, because I know you've worked over time with students and you're very well versed as well with the education sector. Explain to me what psychologically this does to children. I know you're saying it's not as bad as we are making it look, but what is the end result when you have children facing the challenges that you're talking about in several schools across board? What does that do to them?
Thank you, Linda. I agree with Jonathan that we need to relook at the learning environment. But I think it's bigger than that. And this is not even a curriculum issue. The issue at hand is how to look at how to provide education for the masses. Because you cannot provide education in this country the way education is provided in Botswana, where you go to classes and they have 20 children. A big country with 2 million people. We're talking about a country where population growth is at over 2.5%. annual growth rate. That means that you still must be prepared for the large numbers that will be coming your way. So we must be able to design our education to deal with the scale. We must be able to design our education to deal with sustainability. So the sad part of this is that we seem as a country really to be reacting to what is happening, but are not very, very deliberate in terms of planning. And this has got very little to do with the kind of curriculum that we have. You just need to be a bit deliberate in terms of what do you think of, how do you provide education for large numbers? Because if you look at countries where they have huge numbers, look at India, look at China, look at Bangladesh, look at Nigeria, that have got very, very large numbers of people, how do they provide education and this basic infrastructure such as healthcare? That should be the question, and that's where as I agree with Jonathan, that we need to call out on the Minister of Education. Now, to be very specific on the question that you've asked, what effect this has on the children, definitely has an effect on them, because there are certain bare minimums that you expect. If you really can't make people travel in crowded matatus and even build certain values in them, if you are not going to reconfigure the quality model and just put children together as they are, then you will be doing very, very well. So I think one of the things that we need now to ask ourselves are what are the trade-offs that we need to have. Do you need to have such a dysfunctionality in terms of having large numbers of children in school and keeping them there for 4 years? Or how do you design a curriculum? How do you design to deliver an education that also aligns with the kind of resources that you have? Because as I've said, yes, we have significant resources. And if you go to look at countries that have really dealt with the infrastructure problems, you look at what President Obama had in the US called the race to the top. You look at what Tony Blair put in called building schools for the future. These are initiatives. You look at what the Australian government is doing. You look at what Portugal is doing, for instance. These are mostly countries in the West. And you look at how you're able to mobilize resources, particularly from the private sector. There is a lot of resources. If you were to convince the pension funds in this country, they are sitting on over 350 billion. They can give you even 20% of this money through open market operations, where they can be earning at 5%, 10% interest as a return on the investment. And you're able to use this money to make sure that you standardize infrastructure in schools, because you know that if you're sure that you'll be allocating at least 20 billion every year for education for the next 10 years, then it's possible to collect 200 billion in 1 year and make sure that you standardize infrastructure in this country. But I think the challenge is that we often look at education from a very, very narrow point. The education leadership is all about what is happening in Jogo House. If you look at with many instruments, you look at the Public-Private Partnership Act that allows for what you call privately initiated initiatives that can allow for people to invest in education without necessarily competing the public sector. These are the kind of options that we now need to be bringing on board. But others just sitting and continuing to recommend an expensive model, I don't think that is going to be the solution for this country. We really need to work on ensuring that we are designing and planning an education for scale. Ideally, there should be no
Kaburu,
business. Right now, we are having a secondary school with less than on this point. We do not need to design now any secondary school that is going to take less than 2,000 children.
Okay.
Because those are the schools for the future. You must design schools for scale.
I hear you.
This kind of
Kaburu, I have to end this show. I am sorry. I have to interject and I have to end this show. But I hear what both of you are saying. 100% transition is a good thing, because then you end up giving each and every child an equal opportunity. But then as a country, we have to be deliberate with planning for that 100% transition. This has been The Big Story. Big thank you to Amos Kaburu, who's the program manager, PAL Network, Jonathan Messiah as well, education expert.